harsh conditions. People expose them on the outside of the space station. A lot of microbes will form spores under these conditions, and they can survive for decades as spores. But they're not going to do anything until they get into an environment where they can actually live and reproduce. So spores are not a problem in terms of being able to spread unless conditions are hospitable. Now, the concern is with some robotic spacecraft, they have a small radioactive plutonium power source, which fairly short half-life, 80 years, it generates a lot of heat. These things are actually red hot, they're glowing. And if you look at the Curiosity rover, it's sort of the big thing sticking out of its backside. It was mentioned there was one in the Martian as well, where he took one for additional power. And if that were to crash in some places on Mars where there's ice just beneath the surface, it could conceivably melt that ice and thereby creating a little oasis where perhaps terrestrial contamination would then thrive. So that's dealt with by making sure the spacecraft doesn't land or fly over on its way into landing areas that have ice. You can then sort of drive from there without any risk, but you're not going to make a hole in the ground and bury a thermally hot source that's going to melt the ice and create the oasis. So, yeah, contamination. Bacteria are quite fussy about what environments they live. So, for example, in Utah, not this last trip, but the trip before I went there, we had a girl from the European Space Agency who was looking at contamination of the station. And there's essentially no precautions to stop microbes spreading from the station in Utah to the surrounding environment. There's a high desert, hot rocks in summer, cold rocks in winter, fairly intense sunlight. And 40 odd metres from the station, there was no sign of any human bacteria living on the rocks. The only microbes there were the ones that actually lived there anyway. So microbes are in most cases, quite tailored to particular environments. But that's a great question.
Yeah. Okay. I can understand, when you made the comparison before about Cook, for example, coming to Australia or other explorers. Yeah. I can understand going to Mars from the exploration sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's there, we want to explore it, see how it can help us. Is there a thought of the next step of trying to colonise Mars, like people living there permanently? It's
a possibility. After expeditions, the next stage will be some kind of permanent station like we have in the Antarctic. People will probably have to spend about 5 years round trip if you want to have overlapping crews. And the thing is, the big challenge is getting to Mars. Once you're getting to Mars, you can add on quite efficiently the ability to travel further. So let's say it takes 40 tons of spacecraft to get you to the surface of Mars and live there for 18 months. That's just say walking around in a spacesuit. Well, let's say you just live in your tuna can. 60 kilos buys you a spacesuit. They can walk for a couple of kilometres. Half a ton buys you a little unpressurised rover that you can drive for tens of kilometres. Another 5 tons. 5 tons on top of 40 tons buys you the ability to drive hundreds of kilometres with an equivalent of Winnebago. So if you have a station there, you can progressively add material that can take you further and further away, and eventually you can start going many hundreds, if not thousands of kilometres around and seeing many, many interesting features. So this is why you want to go from an initial expedition and build up resources to actually have a permanent station. That will allow the questions of whether or not we can actually settle on Mars. And the biggest thing is, can we live out healthy, happy lives there? Or does something horrible turn to our brains, turns to sludge after 10 years? Or, there's too many mutations from cosmic radiation and we end up getting cancer at an unreasonable rate. So that's one of it. Can people live, say, 70 years on average on Mars? So that'll take not only human experiments, people living there the whole time, which they probably won't, I'm going to take, but you'd have laboratory animals and see how they do. You'd run through generations. A mouse lives 2 years, so 10 years on Mars is the equivalent of 5 human generations. or perhaps more. And of course, reproduction. If we're going to truly settle on Mars, people want to will be able to reproduce. And there's several issues of that. Are there actually medical issues there? And also, what level of minimal health care would we accept? I mean, if you're not going to have a full neonatal unit on Mars, you know, even if children can develop and be born normally, unless there are risks, are we going to just accept a higher infant mortality rate? You know, what infant mortality rate? End-of-life care. You know, there will be good medical care, but you won't have a full geriatric unit. So at the end-of-life care, you know, how much less than what is standard on Earth are people going to accept before they go there in return for exploring a whole new world, seeing as magnificent vistas, or pushing back the frontiers of science and human experience and creating new art and all of these things? Yeah.
I've got a bit of a strange question, but one of the paradoxes is we spend billions getting to the moon and looking at Mars, and yet at the same time we've got massive destruction of the planet we're sitting on at the moment, which is, as you said, our home. And I wondered if that came up at all in discussion, that part of that overlook effect, you know, why aren't we doing more on the planet to actually preserve what we've got?
Very much so. People went to the moon for many reasons. It was primarily a social political gesture, the so-called space race. But the biggest return of it wasn't sort of winning the space race or the new technology that people had or the new knowledge about the history of the solar system and the moon that we gained from that. Because the biggest thing we got back was the Earthrise photo. I mean, that photo is probably the most reproduced photo in history. It's been used to illustrate religious books of many religions, philosophical treatises. It's been used by the peace movement, it's been used by the environmental movement, and this is the overlook effect. Secondly, we go to Mars, we're going to have to use our resources very, very efficiently. And you know, better water recycling, really high quality water recycling, efficient recycling of waste materials. So you've spent billions of dollars hauling boxes from Earth for your equipment. You know, you're not going to just tip them outside. You're going to find ways of using them. So that goes down to what materials we make them. Already with things like the space station program, there are things like materials that don't outgas because you're living in a closed, recycled air environment, and you know, things that we just take for granted, plastics and woods and so on, all sorts of things that get emitted on the space station are not acceptable because they're contaminants and they'll build up. Things like that. The philosophical view, the overlook effect. Other technology I haven't imagined. I mean, the space, you know, the space flight, you know, started with Sputnik in 1957. Very simple payload, looking at just basically measuring atmospheric drag, radio propagation, and a few other very simple things. You know, from that we have weather satellites. From weather satellites we have not only accurate weather forecasts, we also have things like predictions of climate change, monitoring the environment. I mean, say, you know, where I work in my day job, Geoscience Australia, we rely on satellite data all the time for surveying, for position fixing, for monitoring of the environment, for mapping of resources. Absolutely essential infrastructure or knowledge infrastructure underpinning billions of dollars of commercial investment in Australia alone, let alone worldwide. All of which helps us, if we use it properly, be better stewards. But this is always the paradox. I mean, it's a choice for us. How do we use our knowledge? How do we use the talents that have been given to us? And a lot of those things were not understood back in 1957. I mean, there were people in 1957 who were arguing that satellites would have no benefit for weather forecasting. You know, within a few years, that was proved wrong. There were people saying, "Oh, there's no commercial advantage." And I think by 1964, a ComSat, the first satellite telecommunication company, was set up. So going to Mars, there are the obvious benefits. You know, the known things we'll learn, and then there's the unknown things that we will learn.
Thanks.
We might we'll leave it there, I think.
Yep.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming along. Thanks for coming on to talk to us. We appreciate it very much. And just there's something for you. And for everybody else, there's dessert yet. So we thought we'd better finish there, otherwise we'll never get to dessert. And thank you very much, and thank you for all your questions.
Thank you. Yeah, fantastic questions.